welcome to week 10. So, this week introduces us to the concept of social stratification, and this is going to be a concept that we're going to explore throughout the course of the semester, or the remainder of the semester, I should say, rather. And I would like to start off with this image. It's pretty obvious here. I cut this out of a newspaper, but I really like it because it demonstrates stratification in so many different ways in the United States. When we first look at it, we see that it's clearly showing stratification by social class. Along the bottom, we've got these different demarcations of rich, middle class, or poor. But if you take a closer look, you can see other ways that individuals are stratified in society. And to be stratified just means to be arranged in a social hierarchy. And so not only, again, do we see people arranged by class, but we see people arranged by gender as well. It's by no coincidence that the man riding the elevator to the top is a man, and no coincidence that the individuals in the middle and poor classes have browner skin than that man, and that we have a woman who is not the one riding in the elevator to the top. And so we see here in this one image demonstrating that people are stratified in the United States not only by class, but also by gender and by race as well. 3 different ways we're going to explore how people are stratified in the United States in the coming weeks. So there are 4 main principles of stratification. One, stratification is a characteristic of society. So how people are stratified in society has nothing to do with their individual talents or innate characteristics, but rather the category that they fit into within a society. The next is that stratification persists over generations. Oftentimes, not only is stratification built into the structure and system of society, so that, when people are born or raised, their place in society is being reinforced by how society has stratified its members generations before, but sometimes we can even pass on our social position to the next generation. So for example, the social class that you were born into, that your parents have, is a social class that you then have until maybe you move out of that social class. The third principle is that different societies use different criteria. One thing that I became aware of regarding stratification is how much in the United States we stratify people by language, by linguistics, by their command of the English language. I studied abroad in Argentina, and one thing I found very interesting is that people would be much more willing to talk to me, someone who very much struggled with the Spanish language, as compared to my roommate, who was a native Spanish speaker. And the biggest difference was because I was from the United States and she was from Paraguay. And I couldn't help but think that in the United States, people would probably be more willing and eager to talk to the native speaker rather than the one that struggled with the language, despite where the individual might have been from. And then the fourth principle of stratification is that it's maintained through a belief system. As people are stratified, it ensures that there is inequality in society. Therefore, there must be some type of belief system that justifies the inequality that we see. Now, again, a tenet of stratification is social inequality. If people are ranked in a social hierarchy, then some are going to possess greater resources than others, right? Which also becomes why, as sociologists, we're concerned about this system of stratification, the inequality that results, the justness of this inequality. Now, one of the belief systems that justifies inequality in the United States is this belief in meritocracy, the belief that the United States is a meritocracy. What does this mean? Essentially, a meritocracy means that a person's social position is determined based upon their hard work. Now, for your assignment this week, I'm asking you to read the article Meritocracy Myth Revisited to examine some of these beliefs that justify inequality in society and based on statistics, how true these beliefs actually are. But that's important. This idea that people's social position is based upon their hard work is a really important belief system that allows a system in the United States where some have so much resources and others have so very little. There are different systems of stratification that your textbook highlights. We've got a caste system, which is typically based on family history and background. And within a caste system, it's oftentimes difficult or nearly impossible to change one's social position. Some examples of the caste system, we can look at the United States under Jim Crow. Also, we can look at South Africa under apartheid. In the United States, we have a class system. So a class system is based upon access to resources, and your social class position is determined on many different criteria, or upon many different criteria. We've got income, wealth, education, occupation, and also lifestyle. When we look at income, we see that income is distributed pretty unequally in the United States, with the top 5% earning quite exorbitant amount compared to the other 95% in the United States. We see that 60%, or the middle income distribution percentile, is actually shrunk from 1967 to 2015, where that top fifth, or that top 20%, has actually increased within the same time period. So not only do we see that income is distributed inequitably, but this inequality is increased over time. Again here, another chart demonstrating how income has changed over time. And again, if we look on the left, we see that the top 5%, the percentage of income that the top 5% has earned has actually increased over time, whereas those in the second highest, middle 20th, second lowest, and bottom 20th, their percentage of income has decreased over time. Not only is income distributed inequitably, so is wealth. In fact, wealth is distributed more unequally than income. And we see that differences in wealth also persist over race. I thought this was a pretty telling statistic here, that the median net worth of white households was $144,200 in 2013 compared to $11,200 for Blacks. Now, wealth is important in a different way than income. So income is our earnings, our salary, and oftentimes earnings and salaries are used to maintain one's standard of living. They might be used to pay rent, be used to maintain a car, be used for any amenities that you would need to, again, maintain your standard of living. Wealth is used in a very different way. So wealth is your assets, or your net, right? It can consist of things in stocks and bonds. It can consist of things such as property. It can consist of things such as savings. And so three things that wealth does that are pretty important to people's livelihoods is that wealth provides opportunities, right? Perhaps you're going to school right now because at some point someone saved money for you to give you the opportunity of an education. Wealth can also serve as a safety net if you fall in hard times, if you lose your job, if you go through an economic recession, if you come down with a medical condition and are put out of work. Wealth can be that safety net that you fall back on. One opportunity that wealth can provide, again, is taking risks, starting a business. So, for example, you start a business and it fails. That wealth, again, can serve as a safety net, right? It allows you to take that risk. A third thing that wealth does is that it generates income. And so your book talks about this. A lot of people who are very, very wealthy don't necessarily physically go to work. Rather, they allow their wealth to earn income for them. So wealth is quite important. Therefore, disparities in wealth become important as well. Now, this chart isn't necessarily from your book, so the percentage and numbers don't quite match up exactly, but I really like it because it demonstrates how social class can't just be determined on amount of money, an amount of income, or amount of wealth, but it consists of other things as well. It consists of one's occupation, the type of job that you have, which would be a very clear indicator for the amount of income that you earn, as well as education. And again, education, occupation, and income all tend to go hand in hand. The one thing missing from this chart, however, is wealth. But I like this chart because it shows kind of generally how classes are divided, not only based upon income, but based upon typical occupation and typical education within these different social classes. Now, how do we explain this inequality in society? I want to briefly touch on these, highlighting the most importance, but your book also does a pretty good job explaining them. So, functionalism would say that there are very important functions that social stratification and inequality serve in society. Um, that social stratification actually has beneficial consequences for the operation of society. I mean, one thing that we could say is that this idea that some people earn more, and the meritocracy or the belief system justifying that encourages people to work really hard. It's probably why you're in school right now. It's probably why you're taking the time to listen to the lecture. You want to earn a passing grade in this class so that you can check off that box, so you can earn that credential, so you can take that to the job, so you can earn money. It's a motivating factor. If we didn't think that we could increase our social class position, and if there wasn't inequality in society and somewhere to get to, we might not be motivated to work as hard. Now, some functionalist theorists that your book talks about are Davis and Moore. And so Davis and Moore came up with the Davis-Moore thesis. So essentially, the Davis-Moore thesis says that, inequality is good for society because some jobs are more important than other jobs. So, we look at the brain surgeon and we look at the Walmart greeter. We can clearly say that the brain surgeon is more functionally important to the operation of society. They save people's lives. They keep people alive, right? They maintain humanity, maintain people, part of society. So some positions are more important than other positions. In order to recruit the most talented people to the most important positions, we need to reward those most important positions more. It's much more important for us as a society to have the most talented doctors and less important to have the most talented Walmart greeters. We want to recruit the most talented people to be doctors rather than Walmart greeters. Therefore, we pay that occupation more. And the criticism, however, looks something like this. We would agree that teachers, particularly public K-12 educators, are more functionally important to the operation of society, particularly more than NFL players. However, when we look at the rewards for these positions, it doesn't necessarily match up with that. Teachers get paid much less than professional athletes. Karl Marx theory says that social class divisions are based upon the capitalist economic system. So within capitalism, there are two classes of individuals. There's the capitalist, and then there's the workers, right? The capitalists are ones that own the means of production, and the workers are the ones that sell their labor for wages. Marx was pretty critical of this system, thinking that this system was going to lead to class conflict as the capitalists and the workers both pursue their own self-interests. He was also concerned about the alienation and dehumanization that took place for this bourgeoisie or working class group of individuals in society. He wanted them to develop class consciousness, to rise up and to change the system to something that was more equitable, right? In which he gives the label of communism for. Now, Eric Olin Wright expands upon Marx a little bit and discusses some positions that Marx didn't necessarily pay attention to, kind of these middle managers, people who don't quite fit into the capitalist category, nor do they fit in the worker category. They have some more power and autonomy than the workers do, but not quite as much as the capitalists do as well, demonstrating other areas of conflict within the capitalist economic system. Max Weber didn't necessarily disagree with Marx that one's economic position contributed to their social class position, but he also didn't think it was limited to just that. So when Marx looks at class inequality, he thought that class status was essentially made of three components. We've got wealth, power, and prestige. Wealth, again, kind of attesting to economic position being important in terms of one's social class position, but also recognizing the importance of power and prestige, right? So if we look at this gentleman here, his platform as Pope has been to be concerned about those who are in poverty, rejecting much of the wealth of the Vatican, choosing to wear the robes that aren't as fancy, don't denote as much kind of wealth or money, right? However, he has substantial power and substantial prestige, and because he holds those two things, he has a pretty high class position in society. We could look at people too, like drug dealers. A drug dealer might make a substantial amount of money, but because they're lacking power and prestige, their class status in society is going to be a bit lower. Picking up on Weber, we have the social prestige score for different occupations. Now, as you look through this social prestige score, you might notice things that are quite interesting. For example, a registered nurse is seen as having a higher social prestige score than a lawyer or a veterinarian, and oftentimes we see a pretty big salary difference between those occupations. Again, we see a secondary school teacher that has a higher social prestige score than a real estate agent. And if we're looking around the Charlottesville area, we know that those positions or occupations are also played quite differently. Sometimes a social prestige score is associated with a higher or lower income, but not always. So again, it's not just about money. It's not just about earnings. We've got to take into consideration power and prestige being social honor as well. Now, Pierre Bourdieu, who's kind of talked about throughout the chapter, had some very important and interesting theories in regards to social class, particularly in regards to this idea of social reproduction. So his theory is that social class is reproduced from generation to generation, particularly through the use of cultural capital, being these tastes, habits, expectations, skills, knowledge, etc., that help us gain advantages in society. So because we know certain things or because we adhere to certain cultural practices, it allows us to kind of move about in different social atmospheres that can confer different advantages to us. So for example, if we go out to a fancy dinner and we know which fork or spoon to use, we know which glass goes with which type of wine, it's going to automatically allow us to navigate in certain social circles based upon social class. I'm going to attach this little clip here on how to marry rich that gets at how, cultural capital is something that is taught, and it's oftentimes taught and ingrained in children very, very young. So when you get to the point of adulthood, it might be something that's hard to learn. Getting at how important lifestyle is to one's social class position. One thing that you can think about is, well, if you were to make a sandwich, what ingredients would you utilize for that sandwich? Where would you go to buy those ingredients? Answering simple questions like that can indicate what your social class position is. This is something very simple. It's probably something super innate. It's probably something that has been taught to you and ingrained within you since childhood, but nonetheless gives a clear indication of what social class you're in and makes you more or less comfortable around people who would choose different options. Now, Goffman looks at social class from a symbolic interactionalist perspective. And if Goffman were to analyze social class, or if we were able to analyze social class for a symbolic interactionalist perspective, we would look at how people accomplish this concept of social class, how we make split-second judgments about the social class of an individual based on things like their clothing, their speech, their gestures, possessions, friends, and activities, right? And by looking and analyzing these things and making a split-second decision about what social class they're in, then we decide how to interact with them. Now, all of these things could accurately indicate what social class they're in, but not necessarily, reinforcing the idea that social class, again, is something to be accomplished, something that's socially constructed through interactions, what Goffman was important about if we go back to chapter 5. So, for example, depending on the watch that somebody might wear or the activities that somebody might engage in, these things would all give us ideas about the social class of an individual. One thing that I think is so important is how social class or socioeconomic status influences our life chances. Right? So sociologists, when we look at social class, we see that it has profound consequences for individuals in all areas of their life. And I just want to highlight a few. So for example, family. Back in chapter 3 in culture, your textbook talked about Annette Lareau's research looking at family and how things like the structure of families and the activities that kids engage in within families, and even how parents discipline and interact with their children within families, all are influenced by the social class that one is in. Now, nothing is absolute, but we certainly notice trends. Another is health. So for one of your assignments this week, I'm asking you guys to read that article and watch the audio slideshow titled Life at the Top Isn't Just Better, It's Longer, comparing individuals who all had heart attacks and the very different experiences and outcomes these individuals had because of their social class position. So, for example, the choices that we make, like what foods to put in our bodies, our experiences when we go to the doctor, the type of medical care that we get, the way that the physicians interact with us, our ability to understand and follow the directions of our physicians are all impacted by our social class, as well as our lifestyle, right? Do we live in a safe neighborhood where we can go out and exercise? Are our parents around to be able to do that? Is that reinforced within our family? Or is it much safer for us to be sedentary in front of a television? And again, these things are influenced by social class. Education. So your book talks about education not only influencing social class, but our social class influences our education as well. In fact, social class is one of the greatest predictors of educational achievement in the United States today. I feel like this graph is pretty telling. If we're going to look at the bottom, middle, and top quartiles, we see that there is very clear differences, and the differences only increase over time or over, educational attainment. Whereas if you are in the top quartile, your chances of graduating high school, going to college, and graduating from college by age of 24 are much, much higher than those who are in the bottom quartile. I also really, really like this graph. Now, if you notice, it's about 10 years old. So it's time, I would say, for these statistics and numbers to be updated. But nonetheless, I'm confident that the trend still exists. So here we see that one's college completion, right? So this is college completion by test scores and parents' income. One's college completion is more greatly influenced by parents' income than by test scores being something like the ACT or the SAT, right? So if you look at those who had low scores but high incomes, 30% of those individuals with low scores but high incomes graduated from college. If we look at high scores, 29% of those with high scores but low incomes graduated from college. Next, work and income. So the type of work that we do and the income that we earn can also be influenced by social class. The type of work that we do might be influenced by our ideas of what our parents do and what our expectations or aspirations are based upon the social class that we come from. And our income or earnings is also influenced by social class. So this graph of mean household income over time, what we've seen is actually income earners at the top, their income has increased over time compared to those in the bottom 4/5, which have some marginally increased, most just about stayed the same. Social mobility. Now, social mobility is something that's important about the social class system that differentiates the social class system from the social caste system. And social mobility is something that is really important in the United States, serves as a motivating factor within the United States. This idea that, we might have been born in a lower social class position, but we can make it to the top. And the media surely loves to sensationalize these stories. Now, how likely are these stories? Unfortunately, not very likely. We do see some social mobility. We don't see a lot of social mobility. And as your book talks about, unfortunately, we're starting to see a decreased chance in generations today to increase social position compared to their parents. We also see that social mobility is impacted by race. So if you look at these two charts on the right, we see that white Americans have greater chances from social mobility compared to Black Americans, something we're going to talk about more as we get to chapter 11. Lastly, social class can impact our experience with the criminal justice system. We are much more likely to be involved in the criminal justice system if we're from a lower social class background. We're more likely to be arrested by police, and we're more likely to be convicted if we're from a lower social class position. One statistic that I find pretty telling is that 90% of people on death row didn't have enough money to afford a lawyer when they were first tried. And that's a pretty astounding statistic. There have also been some research showing that high social class is also associated with unethical behavior, which calls into question this idea that lower social class or individuals in lower social classes are more immoral than individuals in higher social classes, and perhaps this is why they engage in the criminal justice system. You can also think back to chapter 7 and the different theories about why individuals engage in criminal behavior, right? Particularly Merton's structural strain theory as to why lower class individuals might be more likely to engage in criminal behavior compared to higher social class individuals, as well as conflict theory, right? This ability for higher class individuals to resist deviant labels or to utilize their money to get themselves out of trouble within the criminal justice system. The last thing to be addressed along with chapter 8 is poverty. So poverty is defined by this federal poverty line, right? The federal poverty line was developed in 1964 by a woman named Molly Orshansky. And so Molly Orshansky was charged by the federal government to come up with a line determining who was or was not living in poverty. And she came up with the calculation of food times 3. So it was her theory that people had 3 times the amount of money needed to meet their adequate dietary needs, had enough money to live, and those that didn't were considered to be in poverty. Now, this is still the standard that we utilize today, even though there's a lot of criticism about the changing costs of maintaining a standard of living, particularly when it comes to housing. That today people spend a lot more of their income or greater percentage of their income on housing than they did back in 1964 when the federal poverty line was first calculated. But nonetheless, food times 3 is still the standard to determine who is considered to be in poverty. When we look at poverty today, in 2017, there were 39.7 million people living in poverty. And this number has actually declined in recent years, which is about 12.3% of the population. The poverty line for a family of 4 in 2018 was considered to be $25,100. So a family of 4 making less than $25,100 was considered to be in poverty. The map there showing the different poverty rates across the United States is for 2015. And we can see that Virginia, compared to other states, particularly in the American South, has a lower poverty rate. So When we look at poverty, we see that poverty is not distributed equally, that some people have greater chances of living in poverty compared to others. One thing that influences poverty is family structure. We see here that over 1 in 3 single female-headed households are living in poverty. Women have a higher poverty rate compared to men. We're going to explore that much more when we get chapter 10. But one thing this is associated with is the feminization of poverty. The race of an individual is also important when we look at chances of being in poverty. Now, one thing that's important to consider is that more than 40% of the poor are white. So when we look at the racial or ethnic group with the largest amount of people in poverty, it's actually whites. However, only 9.1% of whites are in poverty. Here we can see that those that are Black and those that are Hispanic have a very, very high poverty rate. And lastly, age. So the elderly actually have one of the lowest poverty rates, even though, as your book talks about, there is quite a bit of concern about elderly living on fixed incomes. The age group with the highest rate of poverty is children. And this tends to be pretty disconcerting in the United States because we see children as a deserving population. Children don't get to decide what social class that they're born into, and living in poverty can have some pretty detrimental effects on children and also influence their chances of living in poverty as adults. According to UNICEF, 23.1% of American children under the age of 17 live in poverty, which makes the United States rank second out of 35 economically advanced countries ranked in that category. Romania ranks first with 25.5% of children living in poverty. And you can see here, United States is way down there. And for a place that kind of prides itself on taking care of its citizen and offering a very high standard of living, this is a pretty astounding and disconcerting statistic. So, how have we responded to poverty in the United States? Well, the first time that the United States as a government responded to poverty was with FDR's New Deal following the Great Depression in the 1930s. Before this time, the federal government didn't see it as its responsibility to address poverty. This was something that was left up to civic organizations and religious institutions or individual philanthropists. However, under FDR, the New Deal was instituted and developed different programs that targeted what were considered to be deserving populations. So Social Security targeted towards the elderly who could no longer work. Unemployment insurance targeted towards able-bodied individuals who wanted to work but were unable to find work, and aid to families with dependent children, known colloquially as AFDC, which was targeted towards women with children. And again, at this time, it wasn't necessarily expected that most women with children would be working. This was huge because it was the first time, again, that the federal government decided it was its responsibility to address poverty. Poverty was also something that was widespread. No longer was it something that was only afflicting those quote-unquote degenerates in the United States. Then we see responses to poverty expanded with Johnson's Great Society in the 1960s. We see the development of programs like Medicaid and Head Start, both programs targeting impoverished populations, one in terms of healthcare, the others in terms of educational preparation. However, we see a marked change in 1996 with the Welfare Reform Act, also known as PERWARA, or the Personal Responsibility Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act. And to understand this, we need to understand what was happening in the United States prior to this. So in the late 1970s, as Ronald Reagan was campaigning across the United States, he told the story of a welfare queen. This welfare queen was a woman from Chicago. She was an African-American woman, and she was using different aliases and different addresses and different social security numbers, and she was reaping all the benefits of AFDC from the federal government and living large. And so this got people pretty fired up. They were pretty upset that this woman was defrauding the government and earning so much money. It turns out that that story was based in truth, but not necessarily true the way that President Reagan talked about it. So by the time that the truth came out, it didn't really matter because, again, the American public was pretty fired up that this individual, who was not seen as deserving, was earning a lot of money that was taken from the taxes of those individuals who saw themselves as deserving. This led to kind of this sentiment in society that and your book talks about as this dependency culture. So 1996, in comes a Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act passed under the Clinton administration. What it did is it created TANF, or the Temporary Assistance to Needy Families. It got rid of AFDC and put TANF in its place. TANF was important because it had work requirements as well as time limits. And this is really important and something that a lot of people don't know, that in order to receive TANF, and essentially AFDC and TANF are cash assistance programs, making them some of the most controversial programs that we have in the United States today. So there are time limits that individuals can only receive cash assistance for 2 years consecutively and 5 years total. One thing that these regulations did is that they significantly reduced the amount of people who were receiving quote-unquote welfare, who were receiving cash assistance, and this was seen as a very positive thing. The welfare rolls had been reduced. There are a couple problems. One problem is that limited opportunities for long-term training options. So after 2 years of receiving TANF, it might have allowed an individual to go back and earn some college credit so that could improve their credentials and earning potential. But beyond that, there's not a lot of opportunities for individuals to receive supplemental income so that they can enter these long-term training options. Another problem is it didn't necessarily transition people from poverty. It transitioned people from welfare rolls, but that doesn't mean that their earnings were greater than they had been previously, or greater than they had been when they were receiving TANF. If you're curious about what TANF is, here is a guide that was put together for 2018. And what I want to direct your attention to is here at the bottom. So it says the amount of TANF you receive depends on your family size, where you live, and any income you have. For example, the largest TANF payment for a family of 3 in most rural parts of Virginia is $228 a month. For a family of 3 in most urban areas, the largest TANF payment would be $389 a month. I think this is really important because while TANF remains one of the most controversial programs because it is a cash assistance program, essentially giving cash to individuals in poverty to utilize at their discretion, the amount is very minuscule. And if you think about yourself as a single individual, how far would $228 a month or $389 a month go? And this is for a family of 3, not even one individual person. And again, we can see here that cash assistance has decreased measurably, and we see a market shift right there after 1996, but it doesn't necessarily mean that poverty levels or standards of living for people in poverty have increased. The welfare system tends to be looked at, and people receiving welfare tends to be looked at pretty negatively. Your book talks about the culture of poverty and this dependency culture as being negative aspects about those individuals in poverty, allowing people to maintain an impoverished status and not kind of doing what they need to do to get out of poverty. Now, there's quite a bit of criticisms from sociologists about these approaches, and that they don't take into consideration the systemic forces that would keep somebody in poverty. The last thing I want to leave you with is this idea about the American dream, or the ideology of the American dream, this idea that anyone can achieve material success if only he or she works hard enough. And the American dream is really important ideology in the United States. Again, it's what motivates us to work hard. It's probably what's motivated you to be here in the sociology class this semester, to continue listening to this lecture all the way here to the better end. But I want to challenge you to think about how This ideology of the American dream actually tends to legitimize inequality in the United States. Not just class inequality, but gender inequality and race inequality as well. I hope you've enjoyed this lecture. I hope you enjoy the analysis that I'm asking you to do as a part of Chapter 10 in Analyzing Social Class. And best to you as you continue your work this week.